Okay, so things between the US and Iran have been pushed to a real knife's edge lately. We're hearing these very loud threats of a regional war, but at the same time, there's talk of diplomacy. So, what's really going on? Let's try and break it all down.
So Iran's supreme leader gets on X, right? And the message he sends is, well, it's crystal clear. He's putting out a direct warning to the United States, basically saying, hey, if you start a war, this isn't going to be some small skirmish. This is going to ignite the entire region.
And what was President Trump's response to that? Just as direct, but also kind of chillingly vague. When he was asked about that warning from the Ayatollah, his reply basically left everything hanging in the balance. It really set the stage for this incredibly high-stakes standoff.
So you gotta wonder, is this all just tough talk? Is it just rhetoric? Or is there a real strategy behind all of this? Well, according to an analysis by Victoria Coates from the Heritage Foundation, this is anything but random. She argues it's a very calculated, two-pronged approach. You show your strength, but you also keep the door open for talks.
And here's the thing, it's not all just threats and posturing. What's happening behind the scenes is that diplomatic channels are actually open. US and Iranian officials are actually scheduled to meet in Turkey. It just goes to show that even when things seem like they're right on the brink, there's still some room for conversation.
And this dual strategy, it's pretty fascinating when you look at it. On the one hand, you have this very clear show of military muscle, right? You've got U.S. warships deployed nearby, and they're pointing to past actions like Operation Midnight Hammer as a reminder that U.S. resolve shouldn't be tested. But then, on the other hand, the door to diplomacy is wide open. These talks have apparently been on the table for about a year, and the hope is to get some significant concessions from Iran, especially on their nuclear program.
So to really get a handle on this whole show of force idea, we need to talk about this thing called Operation Midnight Hammer. What was it? Well, it was a military strike that reportedly did significant damage to Iran's nuclear program. This all happened after something the source calls the 12-day war in June. And now it's basically held up as the prime example, the proof that this administration is willing to take action.
Okay, so what's the end game for these talks? What's the bottom line for the U.S.? It comes down to one non-negotiable condition, a deal that can be verified where Iran completely gives up its ambitions for nuclear weapons. That's it. Whether they get there through military pressure or through diplomacy, that is the goal.
Now, what's interesting is that this strategy, pairing strength with diplomacy, it isn't just about Iran. The same analysis points to another major global hotspot where a very similar approach is being tested, the war in Ukraine. 15. That number represents a really tragic setback. See, President Trump had managed to negotiate a temporary truce, mainly to help civilians who were dealing with an insane cold snap, but that truce was shattered by a Russian drone strike that killed 15 people. It's just a brutal reminder of how savage this conflict is, and frankly, how fragile these diplomatic efforts can be.
So how does the analyst see the situation in Ukraine? Well, they describe it as a grinding, long, hard slog. I mean, there are some positive signs, some hope in these trilateral talks, but the challenge is just immense, especially when you're dealing with a leader like Vladimir Putin, who the analyst says has no compunction about civilian life. It really feels like a classic 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of situation.
Okay, so if you connect the dots here between what's happening with Iran and what's going on in Ukraine, the analyst starts to identify this consistent theme. It's like an overarching foreign policy framework, something you could call a doctrine of strength.
And in the words of Victoria Coates herself, this policy is really built on a pretty simple premise. She says, we now have a president who demonstrated he is willing to use strength when necessary, particularly in a targeted way that changes conditions on the battlefield. The key part there is that this happens before the serious negotiations even kick off.
So how does this doctrine actually play out in the real world? According to the analysis, it's basically a 4-step playbook. Step 1, you show absolute, unwavering resolve. No room for misunderstanding. Step 2, if you have to, you use targeted military strength. We're not talking all-out war here, but very specific strategic strikes. Step 3, that action changes the facts on the ground. It creates a whole new reality. And then finally, step 4, once you have the upper hand, that's when you engage in diplomacy because you're coming from a position of strength. And the source gives us some pretty specific examples of this strategy in action. We already talked about Operation Midnight Hammer against Iran's nuclear program, right? Well, the analysis also points to the action that was taken against the Maduro regime in Venezuela as another clear case of showing resolve by using force.
And all of this really brings us to the core tension of this whole thing.
The big question, right? What's the next move? This entire foreign policy is built around this constant push and pull between the threat of war and the promise of peace.
So if there's one key takeaway here is this. The whole foreign policy model we're talking about is designed to be proactive, not reactive. The idea is that by pairing a credible threat of force with a very real possibility of diplomacy, you force your adversaries to make a decision. You prevent them from just stalling, from stringing the administration along while they keep pushing their own agenda. And that leaves us with a really critical question to think about. When you have diplomacy that's backed up by force, which one ends up speaking louder? I guess the answer to that is going to be written by whatever happens next on the world stage.